Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Game Dev London podcast. My name's Adam. You can refer to me as he, him, and I am one of the hosts and co-founders of Game Dev London. And with me today is Stuart DeVille. How are you doing, Stu?
I'm really good. Hi, everybody. In case you don't already know, I am Stuart DeVille. I am also one of the co-founders slash directors of Game Dev London. And yeah, excited to get chatting today.
Yeah, it's nice to be back and having us two chat about something that I'm really interested in. I know you're really interested in too. I wanted to chat today about emergent behavior. So emergent behavior in video games and just sort of generally beyond. Now, I know it's something that you're really interested in, right, Stu?
It is indeed, yeah. And it's something that I like. I've experienced a lot in other games that I've played, obviously, and I've yet to make a game where there is emergent behavior. So it's like something that I'd really like to dig into. So yeah, let's get cracking,
Let's
shall
do
we?
it.
So let's start with what is emergent behavior in video games, Adam?
So, emergent behavior is basically, to use the words directly, it's behavior that emerges from within the game that was not actually designed by the game itself. Um, so, what you're looking for here are, if you imagine if you read a rule book for the game, the thing that the behavior that would be classed as emergent, it does not exist in the rule book. So, this might be an example of this might be ways that people add objectives to a game that don't exist. So an example might be in Half-Life 2, people try and play the game carrying a gnome from the beginning of the game to the end of the game. That's not in the rules, surprisingly. You don't have to do that, but it is an emergent behavior. Uh, Games where, if you were playing, I don't know, say Grand Theft Auto, and you want to do a street race, but in the main world, it's not you're just doing it with your friends. You agree on the setup. The rules of the game allow it to happen, but it's not specifically defined. So the behavior is emergent. It emerges from the rules and parameters of the game, um, which is really interesting because you'd think that because it's on a computer and there are defined rule sets and stuff, there's only so much you can do. And certainly in a lot of games, that is the case. You can't actually go beyond certain limits. It's just going to be whatever the game is. It's hard to have emergent behavior in a card game, for example, because you only have so many defined cards. You have defined places where they go. You can't really start doing weird things outside of the rule sets. But especially in anything that's got sort of open behaviors. So we're talking physics playgrounds, open world games, anything where it's sort of you're messing around with the numbers and then there's a result. So there's laws as opposed to rules, I guess is the way to put it.
Hmm.
That you can start to get really interesting behavior sort of coming out of those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, like when it comes to when it comes to players creating their own emergent behavior, it's something that happens quite a lot with like speedrunners, right?
Oh yeah.
uh, people who purposely try and break the game and go out of bounds and do all of these things, and even when they do that, like they have to discover what happens when they do that. So again, there's like more emergent behavior, but obviously we're talking about when the people making the game have specifically tried to create an environment where this stuff happens organically. What would be like some good examples of emergent behavior?
Well, to start with, I mean, just picking up at that point is that you are right, which is that a lot of people though they think emergent behavior and they go, oh, that must be when um you can the something like Minecraft where people start off and going and designing things, right? People start making pieces of art and that kind of stuff, or the kind of gameplay modes that come out of it where people are trying to compete. They do fight against each other, which is not really what is in the game, but you can do it. And there's those
Mm.
kind of situations where it's specifically gameplay people class as emergent behavior. But actually, interestingly, glitches and exploiting glitches is a type of emergent behavior because it's within the rules of the game and the game space, but it is a behavior that was not intended. It wasn't expected. And some of the best kind of glitches have become emergent behavior that then define the game. So a really good example is in the game Tribes, which is famous for its really fast flowing combat. You could sort of you sort of skate off hills and things and go flying across the map, and it's all about speed and accuracy. But that's not what the game was designed for at all. The game was designed for use of vehicles across a very large map. So you sort of slowly, you'd move across and you'd take each other out in more like almost like a battlefield. It's only when players discovered that this was a thing that could happen that basically they could. It's almost like bunny hopping. They basically used the jump button to break part of the game, so that when they were going down and up hills, they could use it to build rapid momentum. That they realized they could launch themselves across map, and of course, once that's shared out with everybody else, everyone else goes, "Why would I get in a vehicle and travel? Take 5 minutes to slowly motorbike my way across the map when I could fling myself across it, still have my gun." Da, da, da. And the whole game then became this sort of really fast-paced attack game where and that freedom of motion is the thing that then sold the game to people. People then got interested in the game because they're like, "Oh, you really want to play Tribes?" I only found out about the that it was emergent behavior later on. I was sold Tribes by people going, "Oh, it's so fluid, the movement's amazing, you can like fly all over the map and all this kind of thing." And that was how I got sold the game. And no one said, by the way, the game wasn't built for that. Like it's just a thing the community discovered. I was just told that's what the
Yeah.
game was always meant to be. And it's interesting that the best kind of emergent behaviors almost take over and become what the game either what the game was meant to be from the start, or um, something that then goes on to define that game. And another interesting sort of mechanic of this appears in World of Warcraft, where you've got the idea of originally people could trade items for sort of in-gamey type currency, and then because that just existed within the world space, people went, well, what if I want to use actual currency? And then people started spending money outside of the game to buy stuff inside of the game, which is the other side of the emergent behavior coin, is that you don't directly have control over what emergent behavior appears. You can kind of, you can define rule sets and parameters and try and limit it, but I don't think that the intention was to allow people to trade money outside, because if it was, then what would have happened is the in-game auction house, which now exists, would have existed beforehand.
Mm.
And because it only exists, because it didn't exist at the time, people would trade actual currency for items, and that is a form of emergent behavior, but it's not. It wasn't intended, and probably not what they wanted, because it's unregulated at that point, and that's not great. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of examples of emergent behavior, but they all fall onto sort of different sides of the line as well. So it's interesting to think about um, how do you want emergent behavior and how important that is.
Yeah, I think it's important for studios to consider this, right? And it's also why it's really important for you to get some player feedback before you have a full release, because there's some things in your game that you like you say you wouldn't have planned, but players discover just by the nature of when you play with things, right? And then the developers are able to decide like, oh, actually that is really cool. It's not what our game is kind of about. And maybe if you're not too far into development, you could be like, actually, this is a fine point for us to pivot a little bit and change the game and make that like a core part of the game, essentially.
Yeah, and that's
What would you?
also just on that
Well,
quickly, because there's another
yeah.
example I wanted to bring up. Well, exactly on that, which is the thinking about designing around it. There's another really good example, which is not actually from video games; it's from physical games, I guess. So I own a game called Molky, which is it's sort of like Skittles, but not quite. You set up, the rules are, you set up 12 sort of wooden blocks, sort of tall pillars. You set them out in kind of a Skittles like formation. And the game is you are throwing a baton at them, knocking them over. And if you knock over one, you get the points of the number on it. So if you knock over just the number 12, you get 12 points. But if you knock over more than one, you get the points of the number that you knocked over. So if you knock over just 12, you get 12 points. But if you knock over 12 and 1, you get 2 points because you knocked 2 Skittles over. So it's a game that rewards accuracy and trying to be, on the money with which one you
All
hit.
right. Yeah.
Now, the big rule in that game that makes it emergent is that if you knock a Skittle over, you pick the Skittle up where it has landed and continue play like that. So if I were to knock, early on in the game, amazing, eagle-eyed Robin Hood, lock in, throw it, hit the number 12. Number 12 goes flying, right? And I get 12 points. Great. But the number 12 has now gone flying. I have to go stand it up where it is. So now the number 12 is like 4 feet away from where it was for the rest of the game, which means that a whole new. So those are all the rules that I've just outlined. There's no more rules, and the other rules. There are other rules around scoring, but they're not to do with the throwing and that kind of thing. Um, but now there's this mechanic of okay, well maybe I don't need 12, but maybe if I throw a really hard shot and try and smash the 12, miles away, it could mess up somebody else's score or stop them from doing it. And as the game continues, the skittles get further and further apart, and clusters start to appear. The big numbers get further back because there's more hits, or the number 7 ends up in front of the number 10. So if you need 10, you're going to have an even harder shot to do. And that gets really interesting because it means that every time you play a round, it's different because you don't know where the skittles are going to spread out. Are they going to spread out a lot, a little? Are you going to have to do better or worse shots? Are you going to have to launch it? And it can favor different players. Are you more accurate? Are you going to try and be more accurate? Are you going to try and play it so that you are just going to try and slam all of them and just go for like slowly building up your score? And even in a game like that, which is relatively straightforward, and it can't be too comprehensive because it's played in the back garden with 12 skittles and a big stick, basically. Um, it still has a very smart use of emergent behavior to create a really interesting game that every time you play changes the gameplay. And the same is true, and I hadn't actually realized this, the same is true for bowling, right? Because when you bowl your first shot, you don't actually know what's going to happen at the end of it. And your second
Mm.
shot is a form of emergent behavior because it's come from how the skittles have fallen. And obviously, it's very well defined in terms of, there's only so many things that can happen. But think about things like the 7-10 split, or they all end up on one side or the other, or there's a split, but there's more on one side or the other. That was not part of the game. It wasn't defined to happen like that. It's very well constrained, but the fact that every time you bowl, you're not 100% sure how it's going to manifest means that it's a bit of emergent behavior. The other side of this is interesting as well because I was learning today about where it stops becoming emergent behavior and starts just becoming a whole new thing. Because another example for this would be The Sims, which is that people who play The Sims, you build your house, and people start telling stories, right? So
Mhm.
go, oh well, this person, he's gonna have an affair with that person up there, or he's gonna be friends with this person, and you start telling the story. And actually, is that still emergent behavior? Because at that point, you're now just creating the story from scratch. That's not even within the rules of the game. It exists outside, even though it's emerged from the game and the rules of it. The fact that you can define who goes where and what and stuff, it's not part of the rule set. It's not part of the game. The narrative doesn't really exist in the space at all. It's not because it's just because of it, and you put it on top. So it's interesting to think about even when you get too far into creative tools, it can sit outside of your game and have nothing really to do with the space that you're in. But even if you're at the absolute smallest level, you can still have emergent behavior. So it's interesting to think about sort of the constraints of it in that sense as well.